Utah voters say they support the ideals of education, work, and marriage before kids, the success sequence, as important steps for individuals to avoid poverty and live a happy life. But how should you and I respond when these ideas are criticized by our friends who may disagree?
It's very clear that both marriage and family structure are often the number one factor driving some of our biggest problems here in this country. So we do need to tackle them.
On this episode, we take a look at the evidence showing how impactful marriage is on family outcomes, discuss survey data showing how Utah voters and voters across the nation feel about the success sequence, and equip you with a productive approach to discussing these issues. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're pleased to be joined once again by Brad Wilcox on the show. He's a visiting fellow, a visiting scholar here at Sutherland Institute, and he's also a fellow at the Institute for Family Studies, also at the American Enterprise Institute, and a teacher of sociology at the University of Virginia, and the director of the National Marriage Project. It's a lot of titles. Brad, did we miss anything that bolsters your expertise on this issue? Yeah. We're so glad to have you back on Defending Ideas, so thank you.
Great to be here.
So we want to talk again, of course, about marriage and family and education and the success sequence, which has been a common topic here in Utah for a while and nationally for a number of years with respect to upward mobility for the next generation. You recently wrote an opinion piece for Deseret News with the title, "For Kids, Marriage Still Matters." We'll include the link on our show notes. And I want to kind of dive into some of that a little bit and expand on it for our listeners because in part, you make sort of a consistent argument that the data is eminently clear that married parent households have a huge impact on the outcomes for kids. Then you also talk about what does that mean for policymakers? What do we do with what's next? And so the first thing I want to ask you about that opinion piece, you say right up front in your piece, the science could not be clearer. On average, the children of married parents are more likely to experience happier, healthier, and more successful lives. You reference Brookings scholar Melissa Carney, her new book, The Two-Parent Privilege. We've been talking about that a lot on this show as well. Just to refresh for our listeners, give us that pitch again. What is the argument based on the data about the importance of married couple households for kids?
Yeah, Nick, I think it's important that we're living in a culture today where people, I think, are less likely to think that marriage matters. And that's in part because, some prominent voices on the left have, for a couple of decades now been kind of underlining the idea that marriage really doesn't matter, that what matters for kids is love. Love makes a family, not marriage. And what matters for kids is money. And so we can support our families with generous public policies that give families money. And we kind of needn't differentiate between different types of family structures. So that's kind of like the broader environment that we're working in, and that, many folks in the sort of public, eye, or people who have been thinking about these issues have kind of, taken that more dismissive approach to marriage. So I think the challenge for us is to, educate the broader public, particularly younger adults, kids in schools, that marriage matters. And the success sequence is, one of the ways, teaching kids that, getting that high school degree, working full-time in your early 20s, getting married before having children. If you kind of do those three things, your odds of, flourishing economically are just much higher. So that's one way of kind of helping to educate the rising generation about the power and the value of marriage in a broader context, cultural context, where a lot of people are questioning the value of marriage today.
I want to get into kind of what do we do with this information, especially from a policy standpoint, and each of us as voters, what should we be expecting from our elected officials and our policy leaders on things like education policy, family policy. But one more quick kind of context question. It seems that because of all the discussion around the importance of married couple households for child outcomes and this sort of moment we're in as a country around family policy, it feels like we're at a really unique juncture where you have voices right and left. It's kind of there are of course critics, but it's kind of a cross-partisan message of the evidence is clear of the importance of intact, healthy families. And so I just want to get your perspective from the national level and the work you do all across the country on this issue. Does it feel like this is kind of a unique moment, some unique momentum as a country around a revival of truly family-centered policy discussions?
Yeah, Nick, I think it is a new moment. I think having someone from Brookings, a female economist, scholar, kind of making the case that, marriage, two-parent families are basically a privilege for kids, and that we should do more to make sure that, a large share of our children across the country have the, access to this unique privilege of being raised by their unmarried parents. So that's great, and then my work is actually focusing more on kind of how marriage matters for adults today in terms of things like happiness and loneliness and meaning in their lives. And so we're kind of seeing from different, precincts in the academic world, the think tank world, that marriage matters both for kids and for adults and for the country as a whole. So that's a good moment to be in. And the question, of course, is how do we translate that into public policies that make marriage, I think, both more appealing to younger adults and to kids, the rising generation, and then also more accessible to all Americans. So those are, I think, are the two challenges going forward. Is kind of a cultural challenge, and then a kind of an economic, in some ways, or a financial challenge of how do we make marriage and family formation, in Utah and across the country, easier for working and middle class adults, especially, who are having trouble oftentimes in this domain.
Well, let's talk about the policy levers. You write in your Deseret News piece a consistent recommendation from the Sutherland Utah Family Miracle paper, which you were a primary author for, the recommendation of, well, if we recognize the power of the success sequence, that education, work, and marriage before kids yields, on average, a 97% avoidance of poverty for the people who follow that, how do we essentially get that into the hands of young people? And you reference again the recommendation of, well, we just need to educate young people. Let's teach this in schools. So tell us why you think that would be an impactful step, because this kind of blends what you're saying, the cultural component of it. How do we restore this norm? But then also, what are the policy levers to help do that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of thinking about the success sequence, the idea is to have it incorporated into middle school or high school curricula across the state of Utah and across the country. It might be folded into like a financial literacy piece here in Utah, as you know. It could be folded into a family or relationship sequence in either here in Utah or in other states as well. So that's sort of, I think, part of the story. But I would also actually say, given the sort of power of social media in our teenagers' lives, it would also be valuable to have some piece of the success sequence, message being put out on social media, so that the state would get behind, PSAs, for instance, that are making the case in ways that are compelling to our teenagers, across both Utah and the country. So that's sort of one piece of how do we kind of change the culture. We have seen kind of this real paradox that on the one hand, kind of public support for marriage is declining. People are less likely today think it's important, marriage as an institution. But the paradox is we've got evidence, and not just from actually Melissa Kearney's book, but also other research telling us it looks like on some key outcomes, like for instance, college graduation and school suspensions, it's not just that marriage matters for our kids, but that it matters more today than it did like 16 years ago when it comes to suspensions and a generation ago when it comes to college graduation. So I think people need to be basically, educated, apprised of this reality that marriage still matters in 2023.
Let's pinpoint about that for a second, because it seems in some ways surprising. I mean, when you just look at the cultural trends, perhaps it doesn't. But if more and more Americans are saying, well, marriage is less important to me, but the data is showing marriage is more impactful than it was before for kids, why is there kind of that contradictory trend line as far as how people perceive marriage for family versus how it actually impacts the next generation?
Well, I think part of the story here is that we're living in a world that's mediated much more by social media. And that actually speaks right to the paradox in two important ways, I think. Number one is I think that people are being exposed to voices on social media from the left. And I've talked about this in my new book coming out, in February. We've got articles in Bloomberg and The Atlantic and the New York Times and other venues sort of discounting, marriage and the lives of adults and kids in one way or another. And we're now getting voices on the right, people like, Andrew Tate, Pearl Davis, pretty big figures on the online right are also saying marriage is a bad deal for this, their concerns for men. So I think there are these voices online that are kind of making the case against marriage pretty powerfully. And yet the paradox, I think, is that having the benefit of your own two married parents in the household is, that much more protective in a world where, among other things, kids can spend too much time online. And we know, for instance, that married parent families are more likely to protect their kids from going down that electronic rabbit hole, right? So that's just one example of the way in which you got this technological change that makes marriage less culturally valued, even at the same time where you have like intact families are protecting our teenagers from too much exposure to, social media and other, screen maladies. So that's kind of, I think, part of the story that we're kind of unpacking right now.
The last thing I want to pinpoint before we go to a quick break is if we can shift the focus to how do we strengthen the actual institution of the family? So bonds between parents, in this case, marriage being kind of the best way to formalize that bond, especially as it relates to what's beneficial for kids, and then the bonds of the relationship between parents and kids. I think in some of our other conversations on this podcast, so much of the discussion around family policy is sort of tangential to the actual family institution. It's things like childcare, pre-K, education in general, other various programs, which can do some good and have a role. But if we're never looking at essentially within the walls of the home, so to speak, the family itself, what in our society can serve to actually strengthen those relationships, feels like we're missing something important about actually strengthening families. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think for adults, for instance, my new book reports that kind of nothing predicts happiness like a good marriage. And I think, we know actually from data done by, research done by Pew that most Americans today think that, things like education, money, and especially a good job are going to be the key drivers of fulfillment for them. They don't realize the data tells us actually having a good marriage is the best predictor of happiness. So I think there's just, there's a kind of ignorance about kind of the power and the value of family. And, we are social animals. And so having a good marriage, having a strong family ends up being pretty important for most of us.
Well, we need to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you write in your piece about some of the critics of the success sequence. And I want to ask you to kind of give the steelman argument. What's the most generous argument that folks who are critical of the success sequence would say? But then ask for your rebuttal. And you go through this in your Deseret News piece, which again, we'll link in the show notes. So we'll get into that and then also talk about kind of how regular people feel about the success sequence. There's some good polling data we can point to. So we'll give all of that in the rest of the episode. This is Defending Ideas. We're talking with Brad Wilcox. Stick around. We'll be right back.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit SutherlandInstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We're going to continue the conversation with Brad Wilcox, talking about family policy, marriage, and the success sequence and what it means for the next generation, including what some of the criticisms are of this set of ideas and what the right answers to those criticisms are. Before we continue with the conversation, I want to mention, if you enjoy what you're hearing today, please visit defendingideas.org. There you can get access to short clips from this discussion, as well as previous episodes that you can use on social media in your conversation with friends and family. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, all of the major platforms, essentially wherever you like to get your podcasts. Just go to your preferred provider, plug in Defending Ideas in the search bar, and hit that subscribe button. That's defendingideas.org. Brad, I want to ask you about some of the criticisms, because anytime there's any big worthwhile discussion of issues of substance, there are of course differing views. And especially for our listeners, we want to equip folks to understand what some of the differing views are and to engage with them respectfully, even when articulating when something's wrong, giving a rebuttal. So folks who might be critical of the success sequence as a framework, can you walk through what some of those arguments are? And if possible, give kind of what's the steelman argument? What's the most generous read of those who are concerned or critical of the success sequence? Let's start there, and then would love to hear kind of your rebuttal that you go through in your written piece.
Yeah, so when it comes to the success sequence, one of the critics is Matt Brunig, who heads up the People's Policy Project. And from his perspective, marriage isn't really that important. He says, that work does all of the work when it comes to understanding the link between, families and poverty or households and poverty. So that's sort of one perspective, this idea that marriage per se isn't that, important when it comes to financial stability for families today. Another perspective is that when it comes to the welfare of kids, that money matters a lot more than marriage, for children. And so, Nicole Rogers, who's the executive director of Family Story, Philip Cohen, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland, would kind of stress oftentimes that as they look at the research, they would conclude that it's not marriage per se that really is important for kids, but financial stability for children. And so that the answer for them with these kinds of issues is just kind of to give families more money. Now, in terms of Brunig's perspective, I think what he doesn't adequately appreciate is that marriage is connected to work for families. And what I mean by that is that it's just much easier for married parent families to sort of navigate the challenges of work and family, raising children, kind of keeping it all together, both on the home front and the work front when they have two married parents in the household. We see, for instance, in the recent BLS data that single mothers are 8 times more likely to be non-working, families compared to married parent families. That's a huge difference, right? And so it's no surprise that when you look at the difference between single parent families and married parent families, they're, about 4 times more likely to be poor, So I think there's also, of course, too, the way in which family instability just sucks money out of people's pockets like you couldn't believe. So when you don't have parents living together, they've got 2 separate households. Oftentimes you'll have court battles raging between parents. They're paying lawyers. Non-residential dads are paying, child support. This is all very expensive. So the idea that marriage isn't related to sort of family financial stability just doesn't really make sense. Doesn't jive with the data, doesn't jive with people's kind of real world experience. Now, on the child outcomes, to sort of steelman the point, I would say certainly in some outcomes, there's no question that like parental education or money, these classic sort of markers of socioeconomic status are more predictive of kids' GPAs, for instance. Some measures related to like college graduation and some, analyses. So there are some ways in which it's true that money matters and that parents, socioeconomic status matters for kids. No surprise there, right? But on some outcomes, like especially the social and the emotional outcomes for our kids, there's no question, based upon the analysis that I have done, that family structure is more predictive of things like, young men's incarceration or teenagers, sadness or, emotional distress. So money is less important in predicting who ends up in prison or jail for our young men than family structure. And for our teenagers, our girls, for instance, mom and dad's marital status matters more than how much money they have in their bank accounts. We just have to be I think clear here that yes, money is important, but on average, our kids are more likely to flourish when they have the benefit of their own married parents in their corner, and particularly on the social and emotional fronts.
And to put it in simple terms, I mean, I look at, my own life, my wife and I, we have 2 little boys. And if the argument is that money is kind of the core variable that leads to child stability, the implication of that is that if I were to just disappear tomorrow, but my wife and our kids, if I was to be replaced by just a paycheck that was equal, maybe even more to whatever I earn through my work for the family, to suggest that, well, your wife and kids, especially your kids, are going to be just as well off overall. They're going to be okay with that. It seems kind of offensive and dismissive. I mean, to me, I'm like, hey, I'm more than just a paycheck. And same with my wife. If it were just me raising our kids and that was replaced by some kind of financial resource, it seems to diminish the, I guess, non-tangible role and benefit of we talked before about kind of just the human interaction, the human relationship between married parents and what they invest in their kids. It's more than just financial resources. And it ties into some of the other things we've talked about. And actually, one of the other recommendations in the Utah Family Miracle paper of looking at men and boys, that I think one of the issues is that when men do not thrive, one of the major factors is because they don't feel needed. And the implication of, well, you're just a paycheck is just flat out wrong. We are all needed in much more fundamental ways. Is that also part of the rebuttal to this kind of materialistic view of marriage?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the points that Melissa Kearney has made in her kind of arguments about these issues is that there is no way that we would ever pass a public policy that would replace the median man's wage. I mean, so there's, and not even in Sweden, right? So even in Sweden, single parent families are worse off economically than two parent families because there's not enough money to replace that second parent, financially. So we have to be clear about that. I think, and also, yes, of course, it's true that, you're sort of assuming that, the role of typically dads is just a paycheck rather than so much more. Now, I think the other response that we get on this score, though, right, is that what's happening is that in many lower income, communities, and just across the board, there are guys who are, not marriageable, or who don't end up being good husbands or good fathers. And so it's in this context where it kind of makes sense for women to kind of go their own way, having kids outside of marriage or, getting divorced, et cetera. And there's obviously some truth to that. But I think the challenge there is to sort of recognize and realize we could just do a lot better as a culture in helping, as you were saying before, our young men prepare for, a future that incorporates marriage and family life, giving them the values and virtues that would make them better husbands and fathers, and then also kind of helping people to understand that, most married couples go through tough moments for a day, for a week, for a month, for, longer periods of time. And yet most married couples who kind of stick together work these challenges out. And I think we could just do a better job with our married parents of helping them to realize and recognize everyone has challenges and difficulties. And in most cases, of course, not all, but in most cases, it's better for the kids to work through these challenges and not head to divorce court. So that's, and I think this is where, our more progressive critics would disagree with us about kind of the value of trying to do all you can to make a marriage work for parents, provided there's no violence and, no regular screaming matches and things like that. And then also to kind of do a better job of helping working class and poor couples, move more slowly into relationships and parenthood, put marriage before parenthood, take things more carefully, and to kind of give, young men, across the board, but especially in some of those communities, some encouragement, advice, tips, pointers about the importance of, stable work, the importance of communication, the importance of engaging on the home front.
Yeah. And it seems like one of the other themes that keeps on coming up is, in my mind, there's kind of two layers of this debate. Number one, there are some folks who say, well, as you've outlined in your written piece, the success sequence itself is just not as compelling of a framework. And you've given a good rebuttal here and in your written piece. But then the other layer is that people say, well, sure, the success sequence is great. It would be a great thing for people to attain, but either it's too hard or there are too many obstacles that young people face, especially if they haven't seen these things modeled. And you can't just go, quote unquote, preach to them of the success sequence and then walk away. And that's, I think, something that's come up of a point of consensus, is where there is a lot of common ground on the issue is people, again, from different ideologies saying, yes, this is a valuable framework, but let's also make sure we organize at times policy interventions as well as sort of institutional supports to help young people feel that it's more attainable to actually achieve the success sequence. So I think that's something worth mentioning, especially in the context of what you're saying, that it's yes, identifying what the data says and what the ideals are, but then how do we marshal the support for young people to feel like, I can do this?
Yeah, so I think part of the point here is, again, we have to also think about ways to better equip our young adults to thrive in high school, and that's particularly true for our young men, who are often not connecting their high school, experience to an immediate kind of job future and family future as well. Stress the value of full-time work. We are seeing a lot of young men are not working full-time today. And I've heard from lots of small business owners in Central Virginia, where I live and work, that they have often difficulty getting guys to show up on time and to be there the whole day consistently, kind of Monday through Friday, so we could work on the culture of work as well. And then, of course, too, trying to equip our young adults to make better choices about how they move into relationships, into marriage, and into parenthood as well.
So we have to take another quick break, but when we come back, I want to go through some survey data. There's a lot of data on the national level showing just how regular people feel about the success sequence. It's easy sometimes for us in an academic or policy setting to talk about it conceptually and say, well, the data is compelling, but what do normal people think about this? So we want to go through some of that. Before we do, though, I want to ask you to finish off this segment. You mentioned in your written piece for Deseret News that you were raised by a single mother, and there are other high-profile people who were raised by single parents. And I want to ask you to talk about that because one of the other pushbacks, I think, is that, well, if you promote this, then you are implicitly shaming single-parent households today, or saying, well, you guys did it wrong. And of course, that's not what anybody wants to do, and it's actually not what we are doing, in the same way that if we say, hey, you should get a college degree, if a child's parents didn't get a college degree, nobody's shaming the parents for not doing that. We're just outlining, here's some steps that are within your control. So talk about that. How do you blend your life experience with your role as a sociologist to make that case?
Yeah, so I was raised by a single mom, and I think that my mom did a great job with both my sister and me. We're, middle-aged now, obviously, married, bunch of kids, both of, us, and, doing well professionally and personally and otherwise. So I think there's no question that there are plenty of Americans out there who've been raised in single-parent families and step families and other kinds of families, and, have managed to make it. And we know, obviously, that Barack Obama was raised by a single mother, and Jeff Bezos, was not raised in an intact family as well. So there are plenty of examples of people who can kind of, do just fine without the benefit of a married parent family. But I'm also a sociologist, and I can say that on average, our kids are more likely to flourish when they have the benefit of married parent families. That, for instance, young men, as I mentioned before, about twice as likely to end up in prison or jail if they don't have the benefit of their own married parent families kind of in their corner. We know that our teenagers are about 50% more likely to say that they're sad if they don't live with their own married parents. So there's a way in which family instability tends to increase risks for our kids. And especially at the kind of the aggregate level, across an entire city or entire neighborhood or state, when there are a lot of single parent families, when there are a lot of, families that are not forming in the first place, we see some pretty bad outcomes, whether it's more crime, whether it's fewer kids realizing the American dream financially, whether it's falling rates of happiness, So we have to just hold kind of at the same time together these two ideas that there are plenty of individual kids and adults who flourish apart from stable marriage, no doubt. And there are obviously plenty of, intact families that are doing terribly. But on average, kids, adults, and communities are more likely to be flourishing when they're grounded on stable married families.
So we want to take one more break. When we come back, I want to talk through some of the survey data. But to finish off, I just want to read this quote from your written piece because I think it helps to encapsulate what you just said in a very powerful way. You write, those raised in single-parent households, including this author, can still love and appreciate their own parents and families while recognizing that the data is clear. On average, marriage matters to our kids. So that seems to be kind of the answer to that question of, are we shaming people?
And I think the other important point, I gave a talk in Florida recently, and there were, a number of single moms in the audience. It was a women's audience. And, I was kind of thinking about their response and whatnot. I think where there may have been some concerns about my message about marriage in this audience, but I think where we could find common ground is to sort of basically say, look, things have happened in your own life, in your own marriage, in your own situation, no doubt, understandable. But what do you want for your own children? right? And I think the vast majority of us, including those moms of this audience, would like for their own kids to have the benefit of a decent marriage and a stable family life. So that's, I think, kind of thinking too about what do we want for our kids and for the rising generation more generally.
Well, with that, we're going to take our last break with Brad before we get into some of the survey data locally and nationally to equip you with a better understanding of what regular folks think about this issue. This is Defending Ideas. We've been talking with Brad Wilcox. Stick around. We'll be right back.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and our guest this week has been Brad Wilcox, who's an expert on all things related to family policy, marriage, and especially what matters for kids in the next generation with respect to the impact of married couple households and how marriage impacts adults and adults' happiness and well-being. The last segment of this podcast, we're going to talk about some survey data that goes through what Utahns and what Americans think about each pillar of the success sequence to help round out the conversation. Before we do that, though, I want to mention briefly, if you're enjoying this episode, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find full episode links as well as short clips that are easy to share on social media and things that you can use in your conversations about these issues with friends and family. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, all the major platforms. Wherever you like to get your shows, just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. That's defendingideas.org. Brad, to finish off the discussion, there's some brand new survey data from here in Utah, and I also want to ask you kind of how that compares with things on the national level. So I want to mention a couple of stats to give our listeners a sense of regular voters. How are they viewing these kinds of issues and these kinds of discussions? Because as I said before, it's easy to talk about it in sort of an academic or policy setting, but where does this translate into kitchen table issues for regular Utahns and regular Americans? So a couple of stats to get your reaction to. New survey data in Utah show that of Utah likely voters, 89% recognize the impact of finishing high school as something that's an important step to take for individuals to secure a successful and happy life. And that's a mix of strongly agree and somewhat agree. So 89% recognize the impact of high school. 86% see the benefit of full-time work for individuals and families, and then 68% view marriage before having children as important to a successful and happy life. So there is a difference between education and work compared to marriage. It's still super majorities for all three, but that survey data here in Utah, how does that strike you, and how does that align with things you're seeing elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it perfectly aligns with kind of the broader trends we're seeing in terms of people's attitudes about education, work, and marriage more generally, right? So I mentioned before that we're seeing in data from recent Wall Street Journal polling and from Pew Research Center polling that Americans are more likely to kind of prioritize education, especially work, on the fulfillment side. But I think it's kind of part and parcel of a broader kind of focus on these core institutions, and to discount kind of the value of marriage per se when it comes to fulfillment. So I think there's a way in which that kind of, that perspective also kind of is shaping their views about what's important financially for young adults when it comes to kind of moving forward in America today.
I also want to mention one or two other stats because it's one of the central questions is, like we talked about, what do we do with this information? Should we equip young people with it? And if so, how? And some survey data that helps to kind of flesh out some context for that. When Utah likely voters were asked about the success sequence as a framework, so it's one thing to say, okay, the individual pillars of education, work, and marriage before kids, and again, strong majorities recognizing those as important. But kind of when it's tied together as the success sequence, and especially when we're asking folks, knowing that these things and the data correlate with avoiding poverty, what's your reaction then? And it's, again, very, very strong majorities of Utahns recognizing when they're asked about thinking about each aspect of the success sequence, how important do you think it is to achieve each of these steps to avoid poverty as an adult? And it's 97% who recognize that education is important. 97% recognize work as important. And then 76% recognize marriage before kids as important. So it's kind of when it's tied together, it still maintains those really strong majorities. And then perhaps most notably for our discussion in the policy context is whether or not to teach it in schools. And it's 73% of Utahns support teaching the success sequence in schools. And again, that's a mix of strongly and somewhat support. So
right.
What are you seeing on the national level? Does anything in that data surprise you about Utah? Does it,
no, what I think what's
diverge from
striking is
nationally?
that, Utah obviously is the state that has the most married parent families. So kind of when it comes to demographics, right now you're doing the best of all the other states in the country. But these attitudinal kind of patterns that you're describing are very similar to what we see in national research. And also we just did a couple of polls in the Southeast, so states like North Carolina and Florida and Texas. And we see similar trends there. But for instance, in the U.S., polling that the American Enterprise Institute has done, what they see is that 76% of American parents support teaching students the success sequence, and 77% of Americans in general. So about 3/4, we see similar kind of trends across the Southeast in the state-based, survey that we've just put into the field. So I think across the country and in Utah, there is kind of about, 3/4 of adults or parents who'd be kind of supportive in some way of teaching the success sequence in schools.
So is there anything that you've seen on the national level? Again, when we think about the criticisms or the pushback that people say, well, what about the families that you're actually talking about that are either single parent households or low income households or sometimes racial and ethnic minorities? Is there anything else from the data on the national level that can help inform kind of these sub-demographics? Because one thing to say, well, there's strong majorities overall. Is there any merit to the argument that, well, this may not carry as much weight for certain other sub-demographics in the country? What have you seen on the national level that can help shed some light on that?
Yeah, well, we see in the sort of, in the national data that about 68% of African Americans and slightly higher shares of Hispanics and higher shares of whites would be in favor of this. So there's a majority of kind of Americans across racial and ethnic lines would be supportive of the success sequence in schools. And then when it comes to unmarried parents, for instance, we see that about 65% of unmarried parents are supportive of teaching the success sequence in schools. So, it is striking that there is certainly softer support for the success sequence among African Americans, among Hispanics, among unmarried parents, among millennials as well, and certainly also among Democrats. There is a partisan divide here too. We see that Republicans are much more favorably inclined to the success sequence than are Democrats. So that's there in the data as well. But even for Democrats, the majority would support teaching the success sequence in schools. So I think it's just worth underlining that most Americans across partisan, racial, class, family lines, think this is a good idea.
So as we finish up the conversation, we have just a couple of minutes left. I want to bring it back to kind of that big picture vision of where we are as a country. We recently had Ian Rowe on the show, and he talked, of course, about his body of work, a lot of which ties into the success sequence, his book, Agency, and his experience as a practitioner, actually teaching young people in New York through his Vertex Partnership Academies. And so when we think about kind of where we are as a nation, it strikes me that this sort of collection of ideas, data, and sentiments from Americans and Utahns should serve to create kind of this animating, motivating consensus. As you said, there's some variations in the degrees of support, but if the actual social science data is clear that this is impactful, and if strong majorities of Americans support it, and if we see when in practice that anecdotally it's impactful, do you think this has the makings to be something that can kind of be this cohesive vision, not just in Utah, but as a country, to say that this is sort of the mix of ingredients to help the next generation be successful? And if so, how do we actually move that forward in that way?
Yeah, I think culturally it is certainly, a great way to frame the importance. It's also important to note again that we're seeing, slippage in young men's attachment to full-time work, right? And so I think there was a period in time where just the sort of the marriage piece was kind of in some ways like sort of controversial. But I think it's not that work is controversial, obviously, as your polling indicates, just that there's been some slippage in practical normative support for or expectations that our young men are going to be working full time or studying, in trade schools or in college, whatever. So I think we have to revive basically, and we can have a different discussion about kind of what's happening in our schools as well. But so I think there are ways in which, when it comes to each of the three steps, we could be sort of doing a better job when it comes to educating our high schoolers, doing a better job when it comes to attaching our young adults, particularly young men, to the labor force. And then especially when it comes to sort of helping people understand and appreciate the value of marriage and giving them opportunities, though, to meet people. I think there is kind of a dating crisis that we're seeing, and so we need to think about, nonprofits, whether it's churches or civic associations, kind of organizing new events, to kind of give people opportunities to meet in person and move forward when it comes to marriage, and see new opportunities out there. So, but I think the broad kind of perspective the success sequence articulates is valuable. And then we also have to figure out two ways when it comes to things like, building more single family housing that's affordable for working middle class families, getting rid of the marriage penalty in our means tested policies at the federal level, that we kind of make the economic piece, easier for young adults when it comes to having the confidence to go ahead and get married and then to have, the kids that they would like to have.
The one thing I'll mention too, so with this survey data, the AEI survey we'll link to in the show notes, and the Utah survey data. It's a brand new survey from Sutherland Institute that we'll include in the show notes as well, to give kind of, again, that pairing of where things are here in the state, where things are nationally. And as you've articulated, Brad, there's the data, the information, the survey responses, the principles should serve as this foundation upon which we build a broader policy agenda. And the last question I want to ask you before we close is, we're going into a what will probably be a very intense election year, to put it mildly. Also, Utah's legislative session, other states having their legislative sessions in 2024. So as we look at the horizon of the next year or so, of lots of policy debates, lots of political debates, and lots of debates about what direction we should be headed as a state and a country, any parting wisdom for our listeners? Can we equip them with something that they can carry forward into all their conversations throughout 2024 about these issues that can help orient all of our dialogue towards this evidence, these principles, this data in a way that's productive? What can we leave them with so that they can feel equipped and ready to have these kinds of conversations throughout the next year?
Yeah, I think what's striking is that I think there's a growing recognition that we have a kind of family crisis when it comes to dating, marriage, and childbearing. We are seeing kind of marriage rates at pretty much record lows, fertility rates at pretty much record lows. We're seeing more and more people across the ideological spectrum talk about how young adults are experiencing difficulty when it comes to dating. A lot of frustrations around issues of affordability, especially, of course, with mortgage rates being where they're at. So I think trying to encourage both Democratic and Republican candidates who are running for the presidency and for Congress, and who are serving up there on Capitol here in Utah, to kind of recognize that there are some real concerns about, even here in Utah, kind of giving people greater opportunities, both culturally and economically, to have the confidence to move forward with marriage, and then to sort of succeed when it comes to being good spouses and good parents. So if we could have, I think, a broader recognition that there is a crisis, and that there is a need for us to kind of come to some bipartisan policies that would address both the cultural and the economic features of this crisis, that would be wonderful. Now, whether that happens, obviously, in this polarized world that we're living in, not so sure. But there's always, the hope that we can kind of move forward, recognizing that on some of the biggest challenges facing us, like the drop in American happiness, like, for instance, the stagnant character of the American dream, it's very clear that both marriage and family structure are often the number one factor driving some of our biggest problems here in this country. So we do need to tackle that.
Well, I will echo that and say that it is you're providing a hopeful vision with a robust and needed policy framework around it. And I'll just say that we're going to make it happen in 2024. We just have to choose to be hopeful that we can, and shift the dialogue in this more productive way. So, Brad, I want to thank you again. It's a pleasure having you back on the show.
Great,
Thanks for everything you're doing and the work you continue to do for the country and for the state of Utah.
Okay. Likewise. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Nick.
We're going to take one more quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before you go, you might be wondering how to take all of this and use it to defend these ideas when people you love may disagree. I think we can summarize it really in one key talking point with two major components. The social science evidence is overwhelming that kids tend to do better in married parent households, and that the success sequence, finishing high school, working full-time, and waiting to have kids until marriage, on average helps people avoid poverty 97% of the time. Parents recognize this, as evidenced by the strong majorities of Utah-likely voters and American adults across the nation, who, through survey data, say they recognize the power of the success sequence and support teaching its principles to young people. So in conversations, lead with the principle that you and I want every young person to be equipped to lead a successful, happy life. And the evidence is clear that the pillars of the success sequence offer one of the best chances of that happening. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and that you feel better equipped to defend some of the ideas we've talked about today. If you did like what you heard, please visit us at defendingideas.org. You can find access to short clips from this episode and previous shows that you can use on social media. We encourage you to share those on your own channels in your conversations with friends and family. You can also subscribe to Defending Ideas on Google, Apple, Spotify, any of the major platforms, wherever you like to get your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and click subscribe. And lastly, if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. We want to thank you once again for joining us for another episode of Defending Ideas. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.